Wars begin when you will, but they do not end when you please. Niccolò Machiavelli, The Prince. Welcome to the history of the 20th century. Episode 424, From Z to A. As the new year of 1944 dawned over the land of the rising sun, Japan's military situation was grim. The Allies were overpowering Japan both on the Southwest Pacific Front and now in the Central Pacific after the American capture of Tarawa. This caused the Army and the Navy once again to clash over allocation of resources between the two services. The admirals and the generals disagreed over many things, but there was one place where they were in complete agreement. Experience had shown how vital was the role air power played in the Pacific War, so both services clamored for more warplanes. In December 1943, the government estimated Japan could produce 45,000 aircraft in 1944 and proposed to divide aircraft production equally between the Army and the Navy. The leaders of both services agreed to this allocation, but barely a month later, in January 1944, the Navy persuaded Prime Minister Tojo Hideki to increase their share to 26,000. One of Tojo's old Army colleagues, Sato Kenro, was now an official in the War Ministry. He objected. He pointed out to the Prime Minister that the Navy's strategy of luring the Americans into a decisive battle comparable to the Battle of the Tsushima Strait had clearly failed. With the Navy short on carriers, the islands between the Americans and Japan would have to replace them as unsinkable carriers guarding the home islands. This would be the Army's job, therefore the Army should get most of the planes. Tojo decided that was right, and his earlier decision had been a mistake, so he rescinded it. This prompted a loud objection from the Navy. Meanwhile, the Americans were arguing among themselves also. They had captured Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands following a bloody battle. The next stage of Admiral Nimitz's plan called for an advance into the Marshall Islands. The Marshalls are a much larger island group than the Gilberts. They consist of 5 islands and 29 atolls, though more than half of those are uninhabited. The combined land area is about equal to that of the District of Columbia, the capital district of the United States. The Marshall Islands had been a German protectorate until they were occupied by Japan during the last war. Afterward, the League of Nations designated the Marshall Islands a mandatory territory to be governed by Japan, but barred the Japanese from building military installations in its mandatory territories. Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1935 after that body denounced the Japanese invasion and occupation of Manchuria. But it did not relinquish control over its mandatory territories, which left their legal status unclear. In the case of the Marshall Islands, the Japanese administered the island group from Kwajalein, the largest island in the Marshalls, or I should say the largest atoll. It's comprised of 97 smaller islands of various sizes surrounding one of the largest lagoons in the world. The Japanese military at first regarded the Marshall Islands as too small and distant to bother defending. But as improved aircraft technology led to longer-range bombers, the Japanese military's thinking changed. In 1939, Japan built 3 airfields in the islands, on Kwajalein, Maloelap, and Wotia atolls. After the Pacific War began, the Japanese built 2 more on the atolls of Mili and Enewetak. Once the Gilbert Islands had been secured by the Americans, the next stage of Nimitz's campaign plan proposed seizing 3 airfields in the Marshalls, with 3 amphibious invasions conducted simultaneously. But after the heavy losses experienced at Tarawa, some American commanders, including Admiral Spruance, who would command the invasion forces, worried that 3 invasions at once would produce 3 more Tarawas. Maybe it would be better to start with 1 island. Nimitz conceded the point, but when he came back with a plan to invade 1 island, his commanders were stunned by his choice: Kwajalein, the biggest island with the biggest garrison in the heart of the island group, which also served as the headquarters for the Japanese military forces in the Marshall Islands. And to make matters worse, any American invasion force headed for Kwajalein would have to pass right by 2 of the other Japanese air bases, the ones on Wotia and Maloelap, and be subject to Japanese air attacks from those islands. Nevertheless, Nimitz persisted. He believed aircraft carriers in the U.S. task force, plus air cover from planes based in the Gilbert Islands, would be sufficient to protect the ships from Japanese planes. The plan began on January 31st. U.S. Marines landed on some of the small outlying islands of the atoll, where they set up artillery pieces. The following day, February 1st, the main island of Kwajalein was subjected to intense naval bombardment, plus air attacks and shelling from those artillery pieces. Then the Marines landed. The American leap straight into the heart of the Marshall Islands caught the Japanese entirely by surprise. There were 8,500 uniformed Japanese military on the island, but most of them were support personnel. Only about 2,000 of them were combat soldiers. The Americans numbered over 40,000. The Japanese were unprepared, hopelessly outnumbered, and American tactics had incorporated the lessons of Tarawa. Nonetheless, as at Tarawa, virtually every one of the 8,500 Japanese fought on till their deaths. Only about 250 were captured alive. American losses numbered 373. Nimitz was encouraged and ordered further landings in the Marshall Islands at a rapid pace. Ebi Island on February 3rd, Engabi Island on February 18th, Eniwetok Island on February 19th, and Parry Island on February 22nd. In Tokyo, this string of setbacks set off another round of arguments between the Army and the Navy. On February 10th, during a meeting at the Imperial Palace, Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Nagano Osami insisted that the war against the enemy would be won or lost at sea and demanded more planes. Army Chief of Staff Sugiyama Tatsumaru angrily confronted Nagano, asking him if the Navy got all the planes it was requesting, could it reverse the course of the war? An equally angry Nagano shot back the same question. If the Army got all of the planes it wanted, could it turn everything around? In the end, they settled on a compromise. The 1944 production target would be increased to 50,000 planes. This would be possible if fighter production was increased at the expense of bomber production. The 50,000 planes would be allocated equally, so both services would receive more planes than under the original plan. As the Americans were advancing into the Marshall Islands, Japanese commanders at Truk grew worried. The atoll of Truk, in the Caroline Islands, became the Japanese Navy's main forward base in the Pacific. It was a major port, naval base, and air base, the center of Japanese military power in the Pacific. And Japanese bombers based at Truk were capable of reaching Eniwetok in the Marshalls. The Americans decided they had to neutralize the airfields on Truk to protect the forces attacking Eniwetok. 5 American fleet carriers, USS Enterprise, Intrepid, Essex, the New Yorktown, and Bunker Hill, along with 4 light carriers, collectively carrying more than 500 planes, were dispatched to attack Truk. escorted by 7 battleships plus cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese Ontruk had taken note of American B-24 reconnaissance flights appearing overhead in early February and pulled back their most important warships to safer ports farther west. The Americans executed a surprise carrier attack on February 17th. American pilots were flying the Navy's newest fighter, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. They shot down about 30 Japanese Zeros. Bombers destroyed 70 more planes on the ground. The American pilots thought of this surprise carrier attack as payback for Pearl Harbor. They were disappointed when they saw that the big capital ships were gone. They needn't have been. They sank several Japanese warships and 30 cargo ships, transports, and other support vessels, over 200,000 tons of shipping altogether, and destroyed 17,000 tons of precious naval and aviation fuel. Those losses alone were a heavy blow, but the attack also destroyed Truk's value as a supply and support base for Japanese ships and aircraft, and made Japanese shipping between the home islands and the Southwest Pacific even more vulnerable. The Navy blamed the base commander, Admiral Kobayashi Masami, and relieved him of duty. The reverberations from these multiple defeats reached all the way to the Prime Minister. 3 days later, Tojo's old buddy General Sato visited him once again with some more unsolicited advice. Japanese forces should abandon the Carolines and the Marianas and fall back to the Philippines. Tojo could hardly believe what he was hearing. Just a few months ago, the top Army and Navy commanders meeting with the Emperor identified the Carolines and the Marianas as Japan's final defensive line. And here was Sato suggesting they be abandoned without a fight. Japan had only 7 airfields in the region, Sato pointed out, and the Americans had already proved they could bring in sufficient numbers of carrier aircraft to overwhelm them. The Philippines were a whole other story. An archipelago of hundreds of islands, every one of them large enough to host a major air base or a sizable military unit. Japan could fortify the Philippines and dare the Americans to come for them. They would be Japan's last line of defense. If the Philippines fell, the war would be over in any case. Sato's advice spurred Tojo to rethink the war effort, but not in the way he'd intended. That evening, Tojo summoned General Sugiyama, the Army Chief of Staff, and asked for his resignation. Given the critical situation, Tojo explained, he thought it best that he himself assume the position of Army Chief of Staff, in addition to serving as War Minister and Prime Minister. Sugiyama protested. This violated the Japanese tradition of separate political and military leadership. He cited Hitler's assuming the role of commander of the German military and the defeat at Stalingrad as evidence of what can happen if one person assumes too much control. Hitler was an enlisted man, Tojo told him. I am a general. The following day, Tojo replaced Navy Chief of Staff Nagano with his naval minister, Shimada Shigetaro. The 5 most important wartime positions in Japan, Prime Minister, War Minister, Naval Minister, and Army and Navy Chiefs of Staff, were now in the hands of 2 men, Tojo and his hand-picked Naval Minister. Tojo contacted Sato, who was drawing up his plan for a last stand in the Philippines, and told him Japan would make its last stand at the Carolines and the Marianas. Sato did not approve of that decision, but he supported Tojo's consolidation of power. Not everyone did. The former Prime Minister, Prince Konoye, believed Tojo's leadership was what has gotten Japan into this predicament in the first place, and tried to recruit a potential replacement, someone prepared to talk peace with the Allies, someone the Emperor might be persuaded to support. The Emperor's next younger brother, Prince Chichibu, also had concerns. He wrote to Tojo to ask, What will you do when the General Staff and the War Ministry do not agree on the conduct of the war? Tojo sent a testy reply in which he wrote, "The most important thing before us at this stage is to achieve victory. I'll thank you to discuss personal affairs after the war is over." In 1937, a 44-year-old Navy captain named Takagi Sokichi was made chief of the Navy Ministry's research section. In that position, he developed many contacts among the civilian politicians serving in various Japanese governments. Takagi had advised against the decision to declare war on the United States, and for this reason, he was reassigned in 1942. In 1943, he was promoted to Rear Admiral, and Navy Minister Shimada assigned him a special task. The new admiral was to prepare a report analyzing the Japanese defeats of the previous year and to make recommendations on how to improve the Navy's performance. Takagi spent much of his report analyzing Japanese merchant shipping losses, which he regarded as disastrous to the Japanese war effort, and noted that despite the alarming losses, most of which were due to American submarines, the Navy was doing little to combat the problem. I touched on the subject of the Navy's aversion to using its own submarines against Allied shipping back in episode 397. To the Japanese, that kind of warfare was cowardly and dishonorable, hence the Japanese preference for using submarines to support their surface ships in engagements with enemy warships. The trouble was, the Americans had no such reservations. For 3 years now, the Americans had been involved with the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, first in support of the Royal Navy, then as combatants themselves. If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then the Americans must have sincerely admired Admiral Dönitz. Having learned his tactics in the Atlantic, they proceeded to apply them in the Pacific against Japan and sought to choke off shipments of vital war materiel, especially liquid fuels, from Southeast Asia to the home islands. The Japanese aversion to attacking civilian ships was one thing, but officers in the Imperial Navy had little enthusiasm for anti-submarine warfare either. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Navy had only 2 staff officers assigned to what the Navy called rear line defense, a category that included mine laying, mine sweeping, anti-aircraft defenses, and anti-submarine warfare. Naval officers did whatever they could to avoid these assignments, which they regarded as both dull and detrimental to one's career. At the beginning of the war against the Americans, the Navy had had no plans for organizing merchant shipping into convoys, and the captains of the merchant ships weren't interested in forming convoys either. Much like American merchant ship captains when the U-boats began hunting their ships in 1942, their Japanese counterparts believed individual ships were safer going it alone, instead of forming large convoys that couldn't sail any faster than the slowest ship, and presented enemy submarines with a big, juicy target. By mid-1942, though, 6 months into the Pacific War, and even before the Americans had worked out all the problems with their torpedoes, the sinking of merchant ships had become serious enough to spur the Navy to form the first convoy escort fleet, based on Formosa, and assigned the task of escorting convoys along the Asian coast operating between Japan and Singapore and the East Indies. It was a good beginning, but the fleet commanders were mostly older naval reservists, and the Navy allocated a mere 8 destroyers to patrol a vast stretch of sea. The admirals were reluctant to assign any more destroyers, as their captains hated the monotonous job of shepherding slow civilian ships up and down the coast, and regarded getting assigned to such work insulting. By 1943, merchant ship losses had become too serious to ignore or gloss over. Factory managers in Japan and Manchukuo were clamoring for more aluminum, more copper, more gasoline, more tungsten. Army commanders on the front lines in the Solomons and New Guinea were begging for more ammunition, more food, and reinforcements, but there simply weren't enough cargo ships to deliver everything everyone needed. In March 1943, the Navy organized the second convoy escort fleet, based on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. That was an improvement, although this formation also received only 8 destroyers and a couple of torpedo boats, while the Americans' submarine campaign was becoming exponentially more effective. The Americans were building newer and better submarines, assigning to them experienced crews, and arming them with vastly more effective torpedoes. In September 1943, American submarines sank 31 Japanese merchant ships totaling 172,000 tons, a new monthly record. Even then, it took until mid-November for the Navy to create a new Grand Escort Command and assign it 4 light carriers. This looks like a big step forward, but the carriers were in poor condition and needed maintenance work, and their pilots had no experience in anti-submarine warfare. That same month, the Americans sank 46 Japanese merchant ships totaling 265,000 tons. Japanese convoys rarely included more than 5 ships. The Admiralty ordered bigger convoys, but bigger meant perhaps 20 ships. In the Atlantic, Allied convoys typically included 70 ships plus their escorts. The new convoy system went into effect in March 1944, and that month's losses were substantially lower, just 29 sinkings, down from 53 in February. The new system was working. Oh, but no. The Americans had merely reduced their submarine patrols in March, so their subcrews could undergo training for new tactics based on the German Wolfpack system, in which submarines attacked enemy convoys in groups rather than individually. As for Admiral Takagi's report, he had certainly come up with conclusions and recommendations, but they were far too dangerous to commit to paper. They went something like this. Conclusion number 1. Nothing further can be done to win the war. Japan will certainly be defeated. There is no available strategy that can change this outcome. Recommendation number 1. Japan should attempt to open peace talks with its enemies immediately. The goal should be to reach a peace agreement that would allow Japan to retain some shred of its national honor. Conclusion number 2. The Prime Minister will in no circumstance agree to begin peace talks, and he cannot be removed from his post through lawful means. Recommendation number 2. The Prime Minister should therefore be removed from office by unlawful means, i.e. assassination, and replaced with someone willing to discuss peace with the Americans. Takagi would have been risking his life to put all that in his report, but he was sufficiently convinced he was right to reach out to a couple of fellow admirals he knew to be equally unhappy with the course of the war. He shared his findings with them and encouraged them to spread the word among their fellow admirals. After weeks passed and nothing changed, Takagi grew impatient and began talking with a few lower-ranking officers, captains and commanders, and explained to them that Tojo had to die for the good of the nation. The ever-diligent Takagi had researched other assassinations of political figures in Japan and studied Tojo's schedule. He concluded that the plan most likely to succeed would begin by crashing a car into Tojo's motorcade while he was traveling through the streets of Tokyo. Once Tojo's car was forced to a stop, 2 other cars full of Navy officers would pull up and begin shooting. Afterward, the killers would escape by air to Formosa. Takagi offered to remain in Tokyo and assume responsibility for the attack. The conspirators never attempted to execute their plan, as Tojo was forced to resign just a few weeks later. I will come back to that in a future episode. There is one known case of Tojo himself inquiring about peace. In 1942, on the prompting of the emperor, who instructed him to seize any opportunity to end the war, Tojo consulted with Kurusu Saburo, the diplomat who had attempted to negotiate a peace agreement with the United States in late 1941, and inquired about the prospects of making peace with the Americans. I don't know if Kurusu was acquainted with the famous declaration by Niccolo Machiavelli, which I read to you at the top of the episode, but his reply to Tojo could have been a paraphrase. He said, "It is easier to start a war than to end one." I already told you the story of Plan Vengeance, when American fighters intercepted and shot down the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku on April 18, 1943. Yamamoto had been commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, the main battle fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. His successor, as commander of the Combined Fleet, was the 57-year-old Admiral Koga Mineichi. Koga, like his predecessor, dreamed of pulling off a repeat of the Battle of the Tsushima Strait by luring the Americans into a decisive battle that would end the war. Koga understood the odds of success were not good, but it was still Japan's best chance of pulling out a victory from what was increasingly looking like a bitter defeat. In March 1944, following the American victories in the Marshall Islands and the devastating attack on Truk, Koga developed a battle plan, designated Plan Z. After Nimitz's island-hopping campaign advanced either to the Mariana Islands or to Palau, the next step would inevitably involve a naval advance into the Philippine Sea, that broad expanse of open sea bounded by the home islands, Formosa and the Philippines, to the west, and the Marianas and Palau to the east. Here, there would be no islands to hop. The American fleet would have to cross 1,500 miles, or 2,500 kilometers, of empty ocean and land their soldiers either in the Philippines or on Formosa. If it were not Nimitz but MacArthur advancing, the result would be the same. From the Japanese point of view, the most dangerous move MacArthur could make after securing New Guinea would be directly west into the East Indies, that vital source of fuel for Japan's ships and airplanes. But MacArthur's burning desire to make good on his pledge to return to the Philippines was well known. He would not advance toward Borneo or Java. He would set his sights on the former American possession to the north. So in any scenario, the Americans will certainly send their fleet to, or at least past, the Philippines. Plan Z called for Japan to concentrate its naval air units, totaling approximately 1,000 planes, plus the full combined fleet, in the Philippines, ready to strike as the Americans approached. Koga's headquarters at this time were on Palau, and as a first step, he and his staff would relocate to the Philippines. On March 31st, Admiral Koga and his chief of staff, Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, boarded 2 separate airplanes and left Palau for the 3-hour flight to Mindanao. Just before reaching the Philippines, the 2 airplanes flew into a storm. Admiral Fukudome's pilot changed course for Manila, but it was too late. The plane made an emergency landing just off the coast of Cebu. The admiral survived the crash, but he and 9 other Japanese officers and his briefcase containing copies of Plan Z were captured by Filipinos working for the resistance. They took him to their leader, an American engineer, Colonel James Cushing, who radioed MacArthur to report the resistance had captured a high-ranking Japanese naval officer and a briefcase full of what seemed to be important documents. The U.S. Navy diverted a submarine to the area to pick up the prisoners and the documents, but the local Japanese garrison commander threatened to begin murdering Filipino civilians unless the prisoners were released. Cushing violated a direct order from MacArthur and freed his prisoners, although the briefcase was delivered to the submarine, which carried it back to Darwin, Australia, and from there its contents went to MacArthur. MacArthur retaliated by busting Cushing down to private, but colonel or private, he was still in command of the Filipino resistance on Cebu. As for Admiral Koga, in the other airplane, his aircraft disappeared, and his fate remains a mystery to our day. This meant the combined fleet lost its second commander in a year, which further damaged morale in the fleet at the time when there were already plenty of reasons for a Japanese sailor to feel demoralized. The new commander, 58-year-old Admiral Toyoda Soemu, had his work cut out for him. Toyoda was an intelligent man with little patience, one who had opposed war with the United States. He had served for a few months on the Japanese Supreme War Council, but was removed because of his strong advocacy for increasing military resources for the Navy at the Army's expense. You may remember this name. I mentioned him before when I told you that Toyoda referred to the Army as horse dung and said he'd rather his daughter marry a beggar than an Army officer. Toyoda had inherited Koga's Plan Z. He and his staff revised and adjusted it, though the amended plan, dubbed Plan A, was not all that different. What Japanese commanders did not know was that Admiral Fukudome's briefcase and the documents inside, which detailed Plan Z, were now in Australia. The plans were not in code, and all the Allies needed was a team of translators. The team, incidentally, included 2 Japanese Americans. The translated documents were forwarded to Douglas MacArthur, who in turn sent copies to Chester Nimitz. The combined fleet's main force was stationed at Singapore, because Singapore was not far from Borneo, the source of the Navy's fuel. The tanker run from Borneo to Singapore was short and quick and safe. Plan A was to take effect when the Americans attempted an invasion of the Marianas, Palau, or the Philippines. As soon as the Japanese had confirmation that an American invasion force was headed toward one of those objectives, the fleet would move to the Philippines, top off their fuel, and then intercept the Americans en route to the Philippines, or Palau. Defending the Marianas would be a little trickier because the fleet would not have enough fuel to strike that far from the Philippines. In that instance, a smaller Japanese naval force would engage the Americans and lure them south. Toyoda and his staff had some concerns about the Marianas, specifically the island of Saipan. The Mariana Islands formerly belonged to Spain, then Germany, and then became a Japanese mandate following the First World War, with the exception of the largest island in the archipelago, Guam, which the United States had seized during the Spanish-American War. Excluding Guam, the largest island in the chain is Saipan. Saipan had a Japanese garrison of more than 30,000 and was the site of a crucial air base. Crucial because it was a stopover point where airplanes traveling between the home islands and Rabaul or New Guinea could land and refuel. The Navy regarded it as a possible objective for the next American advance and pestered the Army about ensuring its security. Their concerns became loud enough to provoke a reply from Tojo himself, who offered his personal guarantee of the defense of the island. The Army colonel who delivered Tojo's pledge to the Navy told the admirals that the Army wanted the Americans to attack Saipan. They would be destroyed. Plan A was in place. Once the Americans made their move, the combined fleet, augmented with 500 land-based aircraft, would attack and devastate the American ships. Yes, the Americans had more and better carriers and better airplanes, but Japanese pilots had the Bushido Code. Every single Japanese pilot was defending the home islands and was prepared to die for the emperor, while it was well known that Americans were cowards who were frightened of death. Japanese moral superiority would be more than enough to compensate for their material shortcomings. We'll have to stop there for today. I thank you for listening, and I'd like to thank Carrie for his kind donation, and thank you to Daniel for becoming a patron of the podcast. Donors and patrons like Carrie and Daniel help cover the costs of making this show, which in turn keeps the podcast available free for everyone. So my thanks to them and to all of you who have pitched in and helped out. If you'd like to become a patron or make a donation, you are very welcome. Just visit the website, historyofthe20thcentury.com, and click on the PayPal or Patreon buttons. As always, the podcast website also contains notes about the music used on the podcast. If you hear a piece of music that you would like to know more about, including the composer, the performers, and a link to where you could download it, that would be the place to go. And while you're there, you can leave a comment and let me know what you thought about today's show. And I hope you'll join me next week here on the History of the 20th Century as we conclude our look at American popular music of this period with a discussion of Boogie Woogie. 8 to the bar, next week, here on the History of the 20th Century. Oh, and one more thing. In 1971, famed French oceanographer Jacques Cousteau and his team filmed a TV documentary about Truk Lagoon and the large number of Japanese shipwrecks that lie in its waters, all sunk during the American attack of February 17, 1944. The lagoon is shallow and calm and its waters exceptionally clear, which means the sunken ships can in many cases be seen from the surface. It also makes it easy for scuba divers to examine the wrecks. Besides sunken ships, divers can easily examine aircraft, tanks, motorcycles, crates of munitions, and thousands of other artifacts from 1944. In our time, Truk, or as I believe it is known today, Chuuk, part of the Federated States of Micronesia, has a population of about 36,000 and is a popular tourist attraction, particularly for recreational scuba divers. Tourism accounts for a substantial part of the local economy. In recent years, concerns have been raised about the possible release of large quantities of fuel from the decaying shipwrecks, which include 3 oil tankers. On the other hand, the Japanese position in 1944 suggests those ships likely were carrying far less than their full capacity of fuel. Scientists from Japan and other countries are studying the wrecks to assess the environmental risk.